Good morning. Today is Thursday. Lamed Cheshvan, Rosh Chodesh Kislev, Tafshin Ayin Tes. We are in Teres Menachem, Sefer Amorim, Tafshin Yud Gimel, in the Mamar of Shabbos Parshas Shlach. Mevorachim HaChodesh Tammuz, Tafshin Yud Gimel. And we are on page Kuf Ayin Zayin. I believe we're at the second paragraph of Vayihiyu Bnei. Just a brief recap. The Rebbe is discussing the idea of the Mekoshe She'etzim, the gatherer of wood in the desert on Shabbos. He brought two explanations. The first explanation that he brought was from the Zohar, that he was comparing the Eitz Hadas to the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of knowledge to the tree of life. Right? Mekoshesh is from the expression of Hekesh, which means to compare. He wanted to know which one was greater. And of course we have the simple definition that he was gathering wood on Shabbos. So what's this all about? The Rebbe started explaining this by bringing the Targum Yerushalmi, who says that the problem of the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, was that anyone who would consume of it, would eat from it, would know the difference between, would be able to discern between good and bad. So then I've asked, why is that a problem? It would seem that that's exactly what we're trying to achieve, is the discernment between good and evil, and to know what we should do. So why was it such a terrible thing? We must say, therefore, that the Eitz Hadas in its own right, the tree of knowledge in its own right, is something positive, is something holy. That's why it was also possible for it to be situated, that's why it was situated in Gan Eden. Because Gan Eden, right, the Garden of Eden, does not tolerate anything negative, anything that's opposed to Kedusha. So if the tree of knowledge was there, it must mean that in its own right, it is something positive. It's just that through a myriad of descents and reductions of the quality of the Kedusha, of the light represented in the Eitz Hadas, something negative can come out from it. What is this all about? So the Rebbe started explaining. Let's start from Gimel, the first paragraph on page Kuf Ayin Zayin. Yuvon, this will be understood by first prefacing the explanation Beklolis Inyan Avodah, in the general idea of serving Hashem. Right? And from understanding what serving Hashem is, we will understand how the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, in its own right could be something holy, but through tzimtzumim, through ishtalshalos, through descents, it could turn into something negative. What does the Rebbe want to explain concerning the general idea of serving Hashem? Sheyesh bozeh beis efanim. There are two ways, two modes in which to serve Hashem. Avodah shebemedida v'agbala, serving Hashem with measure and limit, a limited service of Hashem. V'avodah shelamayla medida v'agbala, and serving Hashem beyond limit and measure, beyond measure and limit. In these two modes of serving Hashem, or rather these two modes of serving Hashem, we find in a number of aspects related to serving Hashem. These two modes of serving Hashem, the limited and the unlimited, they exist in the actual service of Hashem, in the contemplations that the person contemplates that bring him to serving Hashem. And these two modes also exist in the chain order of creation, in the divine attributes, sfirot, above in the upper spiritual realms. What's the pshat? So the Rebbe explains. Says the Rebbe, the main aspect, the main point of serving Hashem is, as it says in the verse, Hayom la'asaysom, it is for you to do today. Today it should be done. Meaning to say, V'lei ha-medrash ikir el ha-maisa. The exposition of Torah is not the essential point, but rather It's the action. So in other words, Avodah is the idea of acting. The main point of Avodah Hashem is to actually do it. Not the contemplations, not the study of it, but rather the action, the implementation of it. The implementation of what we need to do. What we need to do, says the Rebbe, is divided into three categories. The Torah, Avodah, Gemilas Chasodim, the study of Torah, serving Hashem through davening, through prayer, Gemilas Chasodim, acts of loving kindness. She'aleim ha'olam omed, these are the three pillars, as the Mishnah says in the beginning of Pirkei Avos, upon which the world stands. So now the Rebbe goes in to explain the Medida v'Hagbala aspect and the Lamayla Medida v'Hagbala aspect in each of these three categories. Serving each of these three things as they are performed in a limited way and as they are performed in an unlimited way. Says the Rebbe, in these three categories themselves, let's first focus on serving Hashem in the idea of action, right? Or rather, in serving Hashem b'maisa, through action. In each of these three categories, each one of these could be in a measured way, and later he's going to move on to the beyond measure. For example, let's focus on the act of loving kindness in the sense of Medida v'Hagbala being performed in a limited way. Although the idea of acts of loving kindness is the idea of abundant mercy, right? Why is a person acting kindly? Because he has mercy on the person on whom he's bestowing that kindness. So it's rachmim rabim. It's a sense of going beyond the usual, going beyond limit. Says the Rebbe Mekal Makim nonetheless. It is possible for this to be performed, for it to have a limit and a measure in accordance to the Torah. The Torah itself prescribes limits or conditions, right, concerning charity or acts of kindness. As our sages say, Omar Kra, the verse states, however, there will not be a needy person among you. The pasuk over there discusses the mitzvah of Shemitah. And in the sabbatical year, all loans that are outstanding become cancelled out. The person that owes the money doesn't need to repay it. We're not allowed to demand that money after the Shemitah, right? But the pasuk carries on and says, however, there will not be any needy people among you, so therefore there won't be any loans, there won't be any creditors. But the pasuk, the Chazal learn from this. There's a Mishnah in Baba Metzia which discusses what happens if a person loses an object, or rather a person finds an object, right? Or in a situation where I've lost an object, and for example my Rebbe lost an object, and I can only deal with one at a time. Says the Mishnah, if it's your lost object and your Rebbe's lost object, yours comes first, right? And it learns it from this pasuk. However, there won't be any needy among you. What does it mean? That's the simple definition of the pasuk. It could also be interpreted that it's a commandment. There shouldn't be any needy among you. In other words, you shouldn't be in a state of neediness. In other words, your needs take priority, the individual's needs take priority over another individual's needs. So from there, the Gemara learns, your needs, my personal needs, come first before any other one's needs. Even the needs of your father or your Rebbe. We learn from this pasuk. So what do we see from this pasuk? That even in acts of kindness, there are rules. So rules means that there's medida v'hagbala, there's measure. And that's al pi Torah. Those are Torah prescribed rules. Says the Rebbe, however, Achmi Kol Makim, nonetheless, Amru, we also, our sages also say, Kol Avakayim Ba'atzmikach, Seif Bali Dekach. Whoever conducts himself in such a manner ultimately comes to such a state. The Mishnah says at the end of Peah that if a person behaves in a certain way, he limps or etc., so on and so forth, or if a person behaves in a certain way, the Mishnah says at the end of Peah that if a person behaves in a certain way, ultimately he will become in that state. And it's a criticism. In fact, there's a story, I think it was from the Chassidim of the Tzemach Tzedek, that they once asked the Tzemach Tzedek, somebody once came to the Tzemach Tzedek to complain that the Chassidim are tzvu'im. Literally means they're colored. They're fake. Tzvu'im means it's superficial. They're not really hypocrite. They don't really internally are not really up to the way they behave. Tzemach Tzedek gave 3 answers. One answer was that if they are tzvu'im, right? If they have a tendency to behave in a certain way, it means they like that particular color. So they gravitate towards that. Number 2, he said, if you soak your finger in paint, in a color, inevitably something absorbs internally as well. So even though you think you may be right, but ultimately something will seep in. And the third thing, he quoted this Mishnah in Peah that says if somebody behaves in a certain way, over there it's a criticism, ultimately he'll become like that. So therefore, if they behave like Chassidim, ultimately they will become Chassidim. But over here, of course, we're talking about it in the simple meaning. It means in the negative sense, right? So it means like this. Vayihiyu, says the Rebbe, when a person behaves in his acts of kindness in a limited measure, with the attitude of Shalcha Kodim, my needs come first, if that's his attitude, ultimately he will come to a state of poverty. And what does poverty mean? The first step is poverty in mind. As the Gemara says, it's in a number of places. In Ksubis, in Adorim, Gemara Ksubis over there discusses dowry. How much money a person should give to his children for dowry. So what happens if he gave child 1 a certain amount? It says he shouldn't give child 2 a different amount. What happens if circumstances change? If he was Oshir v'nasa Oni v'nasa Oshir, if he was rich and then he became poor, or
he was rich when he gave the first one.
He was rich when he gave the first one, and the second one his circumstances changed. He became an Oni, or the other way around. He was an Oni and then he became an Oshir. Does the dowry change as well or not? So that's the discussion. So the Gemara says, what does it mean he was rich and he became poor, poor and he became rich? So one of the opinions over there is, it's not that his circumstances actually changed. His mindset became poor. Ain't Oni ela b'das. He became thrifty. He became frugal. He decided that, he started counting the pennies. So, but in the deeper sense, Ein Oni ela b'das means that the person's Beruchni is the person is poor. In the spiritual sense, the person is poor. So first it starts off by poverty, spiritual poverty. And ultimately the person arrives to poverty in the physical sense. Generally, the idea of poverty is the opposite of holiness. The Rebbe, I think, here means, in general terms, that when we talk about anias, poverty, the concept of poverty is not holy. Holiness is abundance. It says the Kli Shoris, for example, in the Beis Hamikdash, the vessels all had to be full. When you fill the vessels with wine or with blood, whatever it was, Kli Shoris Einem Mekadosh Ela Moli. The sanctification came only when it was full. When we make Kiddush, we fill the cup full. Not only full, our minig is that we actually spill over some. You fill it and you overfill it, right? The idea of Kedusha is abundance. Anias, poverty, is an unholy concept. I made it to give out. You hear what's going on over here? Not only Beruchnis, but also Begashmis in the physical sense. So therefore, even though we might have rules prescribed according to Torah, that my needs become before the others and so on and so forth, but the Rebbe says the approach needs to be beyond measure. Then the Rebbe is going to go on to say also how this plays out in Kav Aved and davening and in learning. More about that mitzvah tomorrow with Chodesh.